You tell me when to go.
Okay, I will give you a count.
Okay.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Hi, my name is Karen Peltz Strauss, and I'm the Deputy Bureau Chief of the Federal Communications Commission's Bureau on Consumer and Governmental Affairs. I am thrilled to be able to be visiting with you by video, but I would be even happier if I were there in person. Thank you for letting me share my information with you in this fashion, and I hope that you have a wonderful conference. Okay, and now I'll start my presentation. I'm going to be talking to you today about some of the things that the FCC has done to ensure accessible information and communications technology. You already know about the importance of such technology. I think that that's really one of the focuses of your Accessible Americas conference, including access to employment, access to education and civic affairs, access to recreation and marketplace and health services, and of course, independence and privacy. But unfortunately, market forces have not always guaranteed access. In the past, recognition of the limits of a competitive marketplace for people with disabilities have prompted our Congress and our Federal Communications Commission to take action to make sure that people with disabilities have the access that they need. For example, often disability markets are too small to make a dent into the marketplace. When people have lower incomes, they also don't have as much market power. And the need to buy adaptive equipment very often discourages purchases. So new technologies often create gaps for individuals with disabilities, and the government steps in whenever the market fails. There are a lot of examples of when this occurred in the United States in the 1970s through the 1990s. We have laws covering requirements for federal agencies to be accessible, for hearing aid compatibility, for national relay services and federal relay services. We have two separate systems, one that's national and one that's for communications within and to and from federal agencies. We have obligations for public accommodations and local and state and governments and private employers, as well as government employers, to not discriminate against people with disabilities. And we also have requirements for televisions to be capable of showing closed captions, as well as requirements for closed captions to be put on television. So you could see that from the 1970s to the 1990s, America was very busy getting these pieces of legislation in place to make sure that people with disabilities have the access that they need. The problem was that at the turn of the century, we realized, many of us who, actually at that time it was before I came to the FCC, we realized that many of these laws that had been enacted were not keeping pace with technologies. And so consumers went to Congress and they said, you know what, we're missing a lot of things. We don't have access to electronic messaging. Basically, there were gaps with respect to the internet, digital and wireless technologies. There wasn't any requirement for web browser accessibility, no requirements for video description, limited requirements for what types of devices had to carry captions or display captions, and there weren't any specific protections for people who were deaf and blind. So what was passed was something that I'm sure many of you are familiar with now, the 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act, also called the CVAA. And what this law does is it ensures that people with disabilities are not left behind as digital, internet, and mobile innovations emerge. It also aligns prior laws that focused on telecommunications and legacy technologies with current communications and newer video technologies. It also fills in the gaps that existed from older laws. Again, video description is a good example. Before the CVAA, we had no requirements for video description. We at the Federal Communications Commission have spent the past 4 years implementing this new law. We have had extensive proceedings over the last 4 years, and we've met virtually every deadline possible. We've issued about 10 new rules on this, and we're continuing to work on it. The CVAA is divided into two sections, or two titles. The first title covers communications. Most specifically, for the purposes of your conference, it requires access to voice over internet communications, whether or not they are connected to the existing telephone network, which we call the public switch telephone network. So it even covers email, and it covers chat and instant messaging, and just about any kind of communication that could occur over the internet, even Facebook communications, although it doesn't cover postings. So it doesn't cover Facebook postings, but it would cover a Facebook conversation, or we have something called LinkedIn here, the conversations that occur over these social media mechanisms. It requires access to these services, which are called advanced communication services. It also requires that these services be usable. That means that they must have manuals and customer service and other means of making sure that people can actually use the service. It's important for companies to identify barriers at an early stage in the process of design and development. And the laws, regulations are written to make sure that that happens. But industry is given a tremendous amount of flexibility to achieve access. In the past, prior laws that we had required built-in access on every device, if it was telecommunications. This now takes advantage of new apps, applications, software, upgrades, et cetera. And it also says that industry can use these apps, use all kinds of software, and even use peripheral devices to make their products and services accessible. It also says that if you have a range of products with functions and features at different price points, you would be in compliance with the law. And our rules on this went into effect in October of 2013. We also require internet browsers to be accessible. They must be accessible to everyone, but we have a specific provision, the CVAA does, on requiring mobile phone browsers to be accessible to people who are blind or visually impaired for any purpose. So our rules we have kind of overlapping rules. We require internet browsers to be accessible to anyone for communications purposes, but for people who are blind or visually impaired, they must also be accessible for accessing any kind of a website. This means being able to enter a URL address, activate home, go back, forward, refresh, zoom, etc. Anything that anybody who cannot see can do with an internet browser on a mobile device, or a mobile phone, I should say, must be able to do it if you're blind, and you would probably be doing that via some audio mechanism, audio means. Again, industry can use third-party apps, software, peripheral devices, but they have to, if they use something other than the actual device itself, they have to be able to make it that extra edition available to consumers at a nominal cost. So again, there's no requirement here to require the content to be accessible. Rather, it's just the mechanism to access the content. And again, this took effect, like the other section, in October of 2013. The CVAA also enhanced some of the laws that we already had by creating greater accountability and enforcement. And the reason that I mention this, even though it's a little tangential to some of the other, to the substance of the law, is that I know that when countries are crafting their laws, they want to know what works. And we can tell you that we really think that the record-keeping obligations in the CVAA work. Having companies keep records of what accessibility features they're including in their products and services and how they've consulted with individuals with disabilities is going a really long way to achieving compliance here in America. We also have a process for dispute assistance. So if a consumer gets a product or service and it's not accessible to them, they can come to us and we can try to work it out with the industry. And we've had, I don't know, probably under 10 of these so far, but they've worked really well, and we've achieved good results by using this mechanism. Consumers can also bring a complaint against a company, and as you see from the slide, there are various enforcement measures that can be taken. And I should mention that I'm going to be sending these slides, so anybody listening to this presentation is going to have access to these slides. We also have to report to our Congress every year, every 2 years rather, on our implementation of the CVAA and how well it's working. I want to switch gears for a second to telecommunications relay services. I know that some of your countries have these services. They allow people who are deaf-blind, or have a speech disability or are hard of hearing to communicate with other individuals. And we've had rules in place since 1993 requiring these services. We have lots of different services at the FCC. Some of them allow for video communication over broadband for people that use sign language. Some of them allow for people who have speech disabilities to communicate with somebody else. A person who's called a communications assistant repeats what the speech disabled person says to the other individual. So these communication assistants are skilled in understanding difficult to understand speech. We have IP relay services that are text-based and also TTY services. We have captioned telephone services, which are used by hard of hearing people, that allow a person who has some hearing to speak directly to the other person, and then the relay operator repeats what the other person says into a speech recognition system, or they type it, and then the hard of hearing person can both listen to what the other person is responding and read captions. The CVAA added to our telecommunications relay program as well by requiring contributions to our relay fund by internet protocol providers, and also making clear that these services are not only for people who have hearing or speech disabilities, but also who are deaf and blind. And also, because we have so many different kinds of relay services now, the CVAA makes clear that somebody using one kind of relay service can communicate with somebody using a different kind. The CVAA also directed the FCC to establish an equipment distribution program, which is called the National Deaf-Blind Equipment Distribution Program. We get $10 million a year that we can allocate to local programs or state programs, and they then give out free equipment to low-income deaf-blind people. This is specifically equipment that's used for communications and information services. This program has been wildly successful. We get accolades all the time. People write in that they are now able to go back to school because they have the communications equipment that they need, that they're able to communicate with their grandchildren. Some people have written in that they can now surf the web. It is a remarkable program. We recommend it to any country that can find some money for this population, which has been so underserved. So we are very proud of this program. We've had a pilot program going for 2.5 years. We are now drafting rules to make it permanent. You can learn more about our National Deaf-Blind Equipment Distribution Program by visiting ICANN Connect. Just type in ICANN Connect on a search engine, and you'll learn all about what we've done. We also have obligations under the CVAA to make sure that people with disabilities can call an emergency number. In America, it's 911 to get help in an emergency. We've recently adopted rules requiring text to 911 that will allow people who are deaf or hard of hearing or speech disabled or otherwise can't get access to their voice, they can't speak over the phone, to text using short messaging services. And we're very excited about that too, because we think that that's going to make a big difference here. The CVAA also required us to create an accessibility clearinghouse, which has information about products and services that are accessible to people with disabilities. And so we developed a clearinghouse, we update it regularly, and are looking forward to making it even better than it is now. The second half of the CVAA, Title II, covers closed captioning and video description and other video programming requirements. Just some background here, some very brief background. The FCC already has rules requiring closed captioning on nearly all television, and I'm not going to go through this slide because I know I have limited time, but the slide that I'm talking about now details what those requirements are. Recently, we adopted new requirements for closed captioning on television that are designed to ensure quality captions. So there's 4 areas that and this is not, the CVAA did not require this. We did this on our own. But the new rules require that captions be accurate, that they accurately reflect the dialogue and other sounds in a program, that they be timed to correspond with dialogue so that there's not too much of a delay, that they be complete so that, in other words, captions start at the beginning of a program and they go to the end, and that they be placed appropriately so they're not blocking people's faces or other important information on the screen. And in determining our enforcement of these rules, we're going to look carefully at whether something's pre-recorded, where there's a lot of opportunity to edit the program and make sure it's captioned correctly, versus it being live or near live. Near live is when it's shown on television only a few hours after it's recorded. We understand that it takes, that for those types of programs, live and near live, there's not as much time to edit and correct the captions. So I mentioned that Title II covers video programming. It does so in several ways. And I know that I'm not sure where you're putting my presentation. It might only be in the section on accessible mobile devices, but I thought you'd be interested in knowing this, so I'm going to go through it very quickly. The CVAA, first and foremost, requires that when television programs have captions, that when those programs are moved to the internet, they retain those captions. I know that elsewhere in the world, not all the time, do you have access to television programs or internet sites that are U.S.-based, but to the extent that other countries have that, this is a great way of sharing our captions with other countries. This particular requirement also requires that when there's a posting of a program that had captions, it have those captions immediately. In other words, there can't be a delay of a few days. And it covers full-length programs and clips. It doesn't cover user-generated information, so it won't cover YouTube videos. It only covers what was on TV. The CVAA also requires a certain amount of video description, which are narratives inserted into natural pauses in a television's program when there's no audio. And this is for blind people so they could follow along when there's no audio. And our rules are much more limited on video description. They cover only certain broadcast networks in certain markets, but we're allowed to expand them. And again, I'm going to move on, but the slide that talks about this will give you more detail about what's required. The CVAA also required that we make sure that blind people have access to televised emergency programs. So emergency information such as tornadoes or hurricanes, earthquakes, or power failures, civil disorders, etc. We already had rules requiring visual access for people who are deaf and hard of hearing, but we didn't have rules specifically requiring access for people who are blind, and now we have those rules. We also have a lot of requirements in the CVAA that we are implementing to require that all the video programming devices that are covered, that are necessary to provide captioning and video description and accessible emergency programming, that those devices have the capability to do so. So, and these rules kick in a little bit later than some of the other rules, but they are going to become, there are various deadlines, but in addition to requiring access to closed captioning, video description, and emergency information on these devices, the devices themselves must be accessible. So blind people have to be able to turn them on, select menu options, choose programs, record programs, and there has to be an easy way to access the closed captioning feature, because some of those have gotten pretty difficult in recent years. So the FCC has a number of consumer guides that we put out, and at the end of my presentation, I've listed these various guides so you can learn more about the various laws that I just talked about. I have 3 slides of guides. And last but not least, I have some contact information. I very much welcome you to email me directly. If I can't handle your request, I'd be happy to send it on to somebody who can. Again, I wish I could be there with you. I read through your agenda. It sounds like you have a phenomenal conference. I know several of you. I'm sorry I can't be there with you. I do hope that I get to see you in July. We're going to be having the M-Enabling Conference once again here in America, and we look forward to seeing you here. You're always welcome to come and visit at any time. We have an international visitors program, and we look forward to continuing our dialogue. So again, thank you for the opportunity to present today. Have a good conference.